Back in 1979, a crowd of angry students climbed over the wall of the American embassy in Iran. They thought they'd hold it for 2 or 3 days, scare America a little, then walk away. But an old man named Ayatollah Khomeini looked at those 66 trapped Americans and saw a golden chance. So he took the whole embassy hostage, and he refused to give it back for 444 days. He starved them, he scared them, and he faked their deaths just to watch them break. And the way he finally set them free turned out to be the meanest part of the whole story. So first, you've got to meet the Shah of Iran. Before there were any hostages, there was a king, and America had put him on his throne. His name was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Back in 1953, Iran had an elected leader named Mossadegh who tried to take the country's oil back from Western companies. That's exactly when the American CIA and the British ran a secret plan called Ajax, knocked that elected leader out of power, and handed the whole country right back to the Shah instead. For the next 25 years, the Shah ruled like a strongman, paid for by American money and American guns. But behind his shiny palaces, he ran a secret police force called SAVAK that jailed, tortured, and made people vanish. By the late 1970s, regular Iranians weren't just furious at their king. They blamed America for putting him there, and that anger had been growing for 25 long years. Pretty soon, an angry old preacher named Khomeini flew home. For about 14 years, this old preacher had been kicked out of Iran, living in France and recording sermons that got smuggled back home on cassette tapes. So when the Shah finally cracked under months of riots and ran away in January of 1979, Khomeini knew his big moment had come. He flew into Tehran, and millions of people flooded the streets to greet him like a saint. He told everyone he'd give them freedom and a fair government. However, the second he had real power, he started building a religious dictatorship instead, banning other parties and crushing anyone who pushed back. The whole country was now a giant pile of dry wood, just waiting for a spark. And that spark got lit 8,000 miles away, in a hospital bed in New York. It all exploded when Carter let the sick Shah into America. By the fall of 1979, the kicked-out Shah was dying of cancer and bouncing from country to country, looking for somewhere safe to land. So in October, President Jimmy Carter made the call that would wreck the rest of his time in office. He let the Shah come into the United States to get cancer treatment. To Carter, he was just being kind to a dying man. But to the Iranians, it looked exactly like 1953 all over again, like America was hiding their old enemy so they could sneak him back onto the throne. The anger boiled over fast. Crowds packed the streets outside the American embassy, burning flags and screaming death to America, and one group of students decided that screaming wasn't nearly enough. On November 4th, the students went over that wall. That morning, a group of students rushed the embassy gates. The women in the group had hidden bolt cutters under their robes, and they used them to snap the chains and break inside. The American Marines guarding the place were badly outnumbered, and since they weren't allowed to open fire on the crowd, all they could do was fall back with tear gas, while the staff rushed to shred and burn every secret file they could grab. Within a few hours, the students had grabbed about 66 Americans and dragged them out blindfolded with their hands tied. One of them was the embassy press officer Barry Rosen, and when the students kicked in his door, they told him flat out that he was now their prisoner in what they called the nest of spies. Then they marched those blindfolded Americans in front of the cameras for the whole planet to watch. But the one man who could have ended it right there chose to make it 1,000 times worse. Now Khomeini never planned this, but he grabbed it anyway. This is the part the school books usually leave out. Khomeini wasn't even in Tehran when the embassy fell, and he never told the students to do it. But the moment he heard the news, he understood exactly what had landed in his lap. Instead of telling the students to let the Americans go, he blessed the whole thing, called it the Second Revolution, and branded the embassy a den of spies. He even sent his own son to the gates so the world could see the big boss stood with the kidnappers. The result was instant and ugly. Iran's calmer prime minister, who actually wanted the hostages freed, quit in disgust within days, which handed total control to the hardliners. The students even rebuilt the shredded files one strip at a time, then printed them in book after book they proudly called documents from the den of espionage, and they used those papers to smear anyone who'd ever talked to an American. And just like that, Khomeini turned a building full of captured Americans into the biggest bargaining chip in the whole region, and he was only getting warmed up. 2 weeks in, Khomeini set 13 hostages free. In the middle of November, the Ayatollah did something that looked kind on the surface, but was pure trickery underneath. He freed 13 captives, and every single one was either a woman or a black American. His public excuse was that these people were already victims of America, so they couldn't possibly be spies. The real plan was to turn Americans against each other, by skin color and by gender, right there on live TV, and to look like the good guy while still keeping the hostages he really wanted. That left 53 Americans in his hands, and soon it dropped to 52. For the people staying behind those walls, the fake smiles vanished. The blindfolds came back on, and a real nightmare moved in to stay. For everyone left behind, the real torture started. These weren't soldiers caught in a battle. They were embassy workers, secretaries, and young Marines. And now they were living through head games every single day. A lot of them spent weeks at a time, blindfolded and tied up, locked in tiny rooms alone, and banned from saying one word to another person. The guards held back all their letters from home, then piled up their Christmas presents and burned them right in front of their faces. One hostage was coldly told that his mother had died back in America, and it was a flat-out lie, said only to crush his spirit. Another man sat alone in solitary for 9 straight months. One was kept half a year in a cell so filthy that centipedes crawled across his face while he tried to sleep, and another was chained to a chair for 4 days without a break. They'd be yanked out of sleep at gunpoint in the dead of night for no reason at all. The highest-ranking American of all, a man named Bruce Lingan, spent month after month stuck inside Iran's foreign ministry, sleeping in a fancy dining room and washing his own socks in the bathroom sink. However, as cruel as all that was, the guards were saving something far darker. Then came the fake firing squads and the gun games. This is where it crossed into something truly evil. The guards would line hostages up against a basement wall, load their rifles with a loud click, and let the Americans fully believe they were about to be shot, then laugh and stroll away. They forced 2 of the women to play Russian roulette with a loaded pistol pressed to their heads. Yet even inside that hell, some of these Americans refused to fold. When masked guards ordered Navy Commander Donald Scherer to lie down so they could shoot him, he looked them dead in the eye and told them they'd shoot him standing up, not lying down, and the guards actually backed off. A Marine named James Lopez scratched a proud little message into his cell wall in Spanish, cheering for the red, white and blue, and his guards never figured out what it said. Another hostage named Malcolm Kalp kept trying to escape, so they beat him and threw him in solitary for around 170 days. But while these people fought to stay alive, a tiny group of their co-workers was about to slip away completely. While all that happened, 6 Americans pulled off the Canadian caper. When the embassy fell, 6 Americans slipped out a side door and disappeared into the chaos of Tehran. For almost a week they wandered the streets, scared out of their minds, until one of them finally reached a Canadian official named John Sheardown, who just picked up the phone and asked what had taken them so long. So, the Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, and Sheardown hid those 6 Americans inside their own homes for 79 days, knowing that if Khomeini's people found out, everyone in that house could be killed. Then the CIA cooked up a plan so crazy it sounds made up. They built a fake Hollywood movie studio and a fake science fiction film called Argo, handed the 6 Americans forged Canadian passports that Canada's own parliament had secretly approved, and trained them to act like a film crew scouting locations. On January 28th of 1980, they walked right through the Tehran airport on those fake papers and flew to freedom. But not everyone got that lucky, because one young officer named Richard Queen had taken a wrong turn in the panic, got caught, and now faced months in chains. Back home, the whole country was glued to their TV sets. And across America, people had never seen anything like this, and the TV would not let it go. Just 4 days into the crisis, ABC launched a nightly show literally called The Iran Crisis. America held hostage, and it slapped the exact day count right in the title. That little late-night show grew so big that it became Nightline, the program your grandparents probably watched for years. Over on CBS, the famous anchor Walter Cronkite started ending every broadcast by counting the days out loud, all the way up to day 444. People hung yellow ribbons on trees and front doors all across the country. Even pro wrestling cashed in, turning a villain called the Iron Sheik into a hated bad guy who bragged about hating America. A famous reporter named Mike Wallace even became the first Western reporter to sit down with Khomeini face to face. And in the strangest twist of all, Time magazine named Ayatollah Khomeini its Man of the Year. Carter even froze about $8 billion of Iran's money and cut off their oil, but the Ayatollah still didn't budge an inch. That's when Carter gambled everything on Operation Eagle Claw. By April of 1980, talking had gotten nowhere, so a desperate Carter signed off on a secret rescue mission. The plan was wildly complicated. 8 Navy helicopters would take off from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, fly 600 miles in the dark, and meet refueling planes at a hidden desert strip, codenamed Desert One, about 200 miles from Tehran. From there, America's best soldiers would storm the city and grab the hostages. But the desert had other ideas. A giant sandstorm rolled in and swallowed the helicopters, and one by one they broke down, until only 5 of the 8 could still fly, one short of the bare minimum the mission needed. It got worse on the ground, because a bus full of regular Iranians drove straight into the secret landing zone, and the team had to grab everyone on it to keep things quiet. So the leaders made the painful call to cancel. Then, while pulling out in the swirling dust, one helicopter slammed into a fuel-loaded plane, and the whole desert blew up in a fireball that killed 8 American servicemen, 5 from the Air Force and 3 Marines. Carter's own top diplomat, a man named Cyrus Vance, had argued hard against the raid and quit his job right after. Meanwhile, Khomeini bragged that the angels of God had saved his country. After that mess, the hostages got scattered all over Iran. That failed rescue terrified the Iranians because it proved America would really come back for their prisoners. That's why Khomeini's people split the hostages up and hauled them off to secret spots all across the country, which made any second rescue nearly impossible. The way they moved them was its own special kind of cruel. One doctor later said prisoners were bound, tied up, and tossed into the backs of trucks like sacks of garbage, and at one point, a driver actually flipped a truck and left handcuffed Americans helpless in the wreck. There was one night the hostages would never forget. In the dead of night, masked Iranians dragged a bunch of them into a dark underground room and shoved them against the wall. All the Americans could hear was the metal click of weapons being loaded, and one man named Richard Queen was so sure he was about to die that he started saying his own last prayers. But not a single shot was ever fired that night. The guards just stripped them down to their underwear and walked out laughing. And right about then, the whole thing started slipping out of Khomeini's grip. One by one, things started falling apart for Iran itself. The longer Khomeini held those Americans, the more his own reasons crumbled around him. In July, the sick hostage Richard Queen was finally freed because he'd come down with a serious disease, which dropped the count to 52. Later that same month, the Shah, the entire reason this crisis even started, died of cancer over in Egypt, so the main demand made no sense anymore. Then in September, Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein invaded Iran and dragged the country into a brutal war it couldn't afford, which suddenly made all that frozen American money look very tempting. But none of that saved the American president. For more than a year, The nightly day count had drummed America's helplessness into people's heads, and they pinned the blame squarely on Carter. So on November 4th of 1980, exactly 1 year to the day after the embassy fell, voters threw Jimmy Carter out and handed the job to Ronald Reagan in a landslide. When freedom finally came, Khomeini added one last insult. With Iraqi bombs falling and his economy in ruins, Khomeini finally wanted a way out, so secret talks ran through the country of Algeria, who carried every message between two nations that flat out refused to speak to each other. The final deal got signed on January 19th of 1981, and America agreed to unfreeze that $8 billion in exchange for the hostages. But there was a nasty little trick buried in the agreement, a rule that gave Iran legal protection, so these tortured Americans could never sue the country that put them through hell, and the Ayatollah saved his sharpest knife for the very last second. He had the hostages loaded onto a plane, then deliberately kept it sitting on the runway, refusing to let it take off until about 20 minutes after Ronald Reagan finished taking the oath of office. It was a cold, calculated gut punch, timed perfectly so that the hated Jimmy Carter would leave the White House a failure, with zero credit for the freedom he'd chased for over a year. 444 days after it all began, the longest hostage crisis in modern American history was finally over. But the scars from those 444 days never really healed. The very next morning, a regular private citizen named Jimmy Carter flew to a hospital in Germany to personally welcome the men and women he'd failed to bring home sooner. And that reunion left a lot of people in tears. But the damage Khomeini didn't stop when the plane landed. Because of that legal trick he slipped into the deal, the former hostages spent the next 30 years fighting and failing to get a single dollar out of Iran for what was done to them. It wasn't until 2015, more than 3 decades later, that Congress finally arranged real payment, around $10,000 for each hostage for every single day they were held, plus money for their husbands, wives, and children. By then, some of them had already died waiting for it. The crisis turned Iran and America into permanent enemies, got Iran labeled a country that backs terrorists, and poisoned the two countries against each other in ways you can still spot in the news today. Khomeini took a takeover he never even planned, and he turned it into the thing his entire government was built on, a government that has now outlived almost everyone who lived through it. So that's the true story of what one old man did to 52 ordinary Americans, and how he turned their suffering into the foundation of his own empire. If this is the kind of deep, untold history you actually want more of, do me one quick favor and hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it tells me to keep digging up the real history they tried to bury, because these stories that shaped our whole world are way wilder and darker than anything they ever taught you in school.